Hello and welcome to the old Fliers. Some things said can be used later to prove how silly you were. I admit to this. When Orville Wright performed the first flight in a powered airplane on December 17, 1903, he declared it to be the introduction to the world of an invention which would make further wars practically impossible. End of quote. That didn't turn out to be true because wars have been anything but impossible. Instead of an instrument for peace, the airplane became a multi-pronged weapon in conflicts. The British military establishment was slow to this realisation. In 1910, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir William Nicholson, regarded aviation as a useless and expensive fad advocated by a few individuals whose ideas are unworthy of attention. End of quote. The first Sea Lord, Sir Arthur Wilson, followed up by saying that the naval requirement for aircraft was 2. End of quote. Douglas Haig, future Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, 4 weeks before Kaiser Wilhelm II sent German troops into Belgium, declared to a room full of generals, "I hope none of you is foolish as to think that airplanes will be able to be usefully employed for reconnaissance in the air. There is only one way for a commander to get information, and that is by the use of cavalry." End of quote. This was a man of limited vision, stuck in the past glories of cavalry charges. 2 years earlier, in April 1912, the Royal Flying Corps had been founded. They recruited pilots from private schools with emphasis on those who could ride horses. Yep, that's true. The RFC wasn't taken seriously as a military arm. Examples of pompous men who have gone down in history for confused thinking abound. Men with no imagination. Then there are those who have made wrong decisions despite having correct knowledge available to them. There is a glaring example of this. World War II United States Admiral Ernest J. King. During World War I, he was a frequent visitor to the Royal Navy as he served on the staff of Vice Admiral Henry T. Mayo, the Commander-in-Chief of the US Atlantic Fleet. King saw action as an observer on board British ships, and it was here he became a fervent Anglophobe. From 1923 to 1925, he had held several posts associated with submarines. King attended a short training course at the Naval Submarine Base at New London before taking command of a submarine division, flying his Commodore's pennant from USS S-20. In 1923, he took over command of the submarine base itself. You would assume then that he would be aware of the threat that submarines posed to shipping. What about the possibilities that aviation posed to shipping? In 1926, King accepted an offer to command the aircraft tender USS Wright, with additional duties as senior aide on the staff of Command Air Squadron's Atlantic Fleet. That year, the US Congress required commanders of all aircraft carriers, seaplane tenders and aviation shore establishments be qualified naval aviators or naval aviation observers. King therefore reported to Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida for aviation training. In January 1927, King received his wings as a naval aviator. For a time, he frequently flew solo, flying to Annapolis for weekend visits. However, the history chair at the Naval Academy disputes this assertion, stating that after King soloed, he never flew alone again. His biographer described his flying ability as erratic and quoted the commander of the squadron with which he flew as asking him if he knew enough to be scared. On the 20th of June 1930, King became captain of the carrier USS Lexington, then one of the largest aircraft carriers in the world, which he commanded for the next 2 years. On the 4th of April 1933, King became Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics and was promoted to Rear Admiral. That background of submarine and aircraft operations should have prepared him for what was to follow. In 1932, He had cooperated with Admiral Harry E. Yarnell in a war game that staged his own successful simulated naval air raid on Pearl Harbor, showing that the base was dangerously vulnerable to aerial attack. He was not taken seriously until December 7, 1941, when the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the base by air for real. King was appointed Commander Atlantic Squadron in 1940 and was promoted to Admiral in February 41 as Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet, and in December, Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet. This was Cincus, a very unfortunate name, replaced with Cominch due to its connotations. There were not enough escort ships available to protect shipping. In 1940, King had pushed a program for construction which was turned down by President Roosevelt. Without escorts, convoys were seen as more vulnerable than lone ships. At the start of the US involvement in World War II, commercial ships travelling the coastal waterways were not travelling under convoy. King's critics attribute the delay in implementing this measure not to strategic reasons or lack of material, but rather charge him with Anglophobia, as the convoys and seaboard blackouts were British proposals, and King was supposedly loath to have the US Navy adopt any ideas from the Royal Navy. This was a dire situation, as explained here.
In the middle of 1942, the Allied navies in the Atlantic were facing a dire situation. For the last 6 months, German U-boats had unleashed a devastating wave of sinkings along the American East Coast, pushing Allied shipping losses in the Atlantic to record levels. 1942 was a bad year for the Allies in the Atlantic. German U-boats had rampaged like never before, and more than 5.4 million tons of Allied shipping was sunk in the North Atlantic alone. It was especially bad off the eastern seaboard of the United States, where American ships were subject to an onslaught following their entry into the war in the dying days of 1941. Whereas the British had learnt the hard way the value of keeping merchant ships together in close formation, escorted by anti-submarine escorts, it was a lesson which the US Navy under Admiral Ernest King had not yet fully taken on board, and it was slow to provide sufficient escorts or an organised convoy system. This meant there were hundreds of lone, unescorted merchant ships scattered up and down the coast at any one time, making it almost trivial for German U-boats to attack. Between January and June 1942, 360 Allied merchant ships were sent to the bottom in this part of the Atlantic by enemy submarines. Of these, just 11 were sailing in convoy at the time they were sunk. During this time, the bulk of the US Navy's resources in both aviation and escort vessels remained in the Pacific, and it took until July, after a 6-month massacre on the East Coast, for the intervention of President Roosevelt to force Admiral King to divert resources to put Atlantic traffic in convoy. After this, losses plummeted. 3 ships were sunk in this region in July and none thereafter for the rest of 1942.
King had refused until March 1942 the loan of British convoy escorts when the Americans had only a handful of suitable vessels. Due to the appalling losses, President Roosevelt directed King to adopt escorted convoy systems. King was an advocate of the Japan First approach as opposed to the Europe First position that was eventually agreed upon. He has been heavily criticised for ignoring British advice regarding convoys and up-to-date British intelligence on U-boat operations in the Atlantic, leading to high losses amongst the US Merchant Marine. King took the position that the solution to the U-boat problem was that the British should bomb the U-boat pens and then the US Army should go in and make certain that no more U-boats would sail. There were other lessons to be learned by the Americans. In these early days, blackouts were unknown in America, and ships sailing the East Coast at night against a backdrop of city lights were silhouetted and easy prey for the German U-boats. The Germans named this their happy time. Another controversial decision of his was his resistance to the employment of long-range US Air Force B-24 Liberators on Atlantic maritime patrols, thus allowing the U-boats a safe area in the middle of the Atlantic, the so-called Atlantic Gap. Thank you for watching. Comments are always welcome. Liking and subscribing promotes new content.